Imagine you are a player at a high energy table playing Dungeons and Dragons. During an epic encounter, the dungeon master rolls a bunch of d6s, the result of an enemy casting Fireball. After he rolls the dice, he gets a concerned expression. He didn't roll it entirely behind his DM screen, and you see a bad result that will certainly kill the player character that was targeted by it. You are the only other person to see this result, and no one realizes that you even saw it at all. The DM turns to the player, his girlfriend, and gives a damage result that is less than lethal. Now you're at a crossroads. Do you reveal your knowledge of the fudged roll, resulting in the death of a PC, but keeping the integrity of the game? Or do you stay silent? After all, it means a party member doesn't die, but at what expense? We're not here to talk about the ethics of fudging dice rolls. What we are here to talk about is the fact that this DM wouldn't have extended the same hand of God damage reduction to anyone else at the table. What do you do when the game master has a party favorite? How do you identify if you, as the GM, are accidentally showing preferential treatment to one of your players? We'll be talking about favoritism and how to handle it tonight on Playing God. I'm Nick Logie, and back in the co-host seat to give us his take on stuff is Xander. Let's fly our spaceship through magma, Nolan.
Hey, man.
I'm sure we've all seen favoritism at one point or another at a table. It's a trap that can be easy to fall into and only requires a DC 10 insight check to identify it while it's happening. Let's start with the obvious. Why would a player or game master show favoritism when everyone is supposed to be equal at the game table?
Well, we as human beings are psychologically predisposed to do things for and avoid bad things for people that we personally care about. Your girlfriend, your boyfriend, your husband, your wife, your best friend, other friends that you're particularly close to. We're predisposed to do things for them that we wouldn't say do for some random person on the street. That's not necessarily a bad thing, as it's one of the things that holds our society together. But at a gaming table, it can be so detrimental to show favoritism to any of the single players or deal with any of the other parts of that particular psychology when you're talking about interpersonal reactions, because role-playing games, as they are designed, are a cooperative storytelling experience between a game master and his or her players. The fact that we have to I'd be able to identify this in and of itself leads to the questions of, when and where is it appropriate to do certain things, when and where is it appropriate to not do certain things. And there's a lot of psychology and things like that that kind of rolls in this giant ball that's really kind of complicated to deal with. But when you break it down to its simplest parts, it's a lot easier to deal with.
Ultimately, you're
um,
going to expect this from pretty much any relationship to some extent.
oh, absolutely,
So, like,
absolutely.
if you don't show preferential treatment to your significant other, then that's just not a good thing. Like, when
Yeah,
I'm not talking about the game table, I'm just talking about in general.
yeah,
Like, if you're willing to give the random person you saw on the street who just vomited on the corner like the same affordances that you're going to give your SO, then there's basically no difference at that point between the two people. You might know one a little better, but there's not really that closeness that is intrinsic to human values.
yeah. Now, while that's a really good thing to do in your social life, definitely show some preferential treatment to the people that are more important to you, because obviously you're more invested in them. When you sit down at the game table, that particular portion of the human condition has to disappear as much as you can possibly make it.
It's kind
And I
of
actually
like
have a story.
well, yeah, I'd love to hear the story, but it kind of goes into a little bit of metagaming in a certain degree, because just like you are separating yourself from your action or like the mindset of your character to some extent, you got to do the same thing for your friends. They're playing different people. You're here at the
Yeah,
table to cooperate ultimately, but telling a good story involves conflict, and sometimes that conflict results in a character death. But let's hear about this story.
okay. So not so long ago, I was running a Dungeons and Dragons game where my significant other happened to be one of the players at the table, and I told my players at the very get-go that I will always let the dice fall as they may, unless it is, severely problematic thing. Like it's going to result in a character death, and it doesn't really make sense that they would die at that particular moment. But we get into metagaming in a completely different podcast, so check that one out.
Yeah, and I don't agree with what you just said and how to really operate, but we'll discuss that a little bit after your story. But let's see what the rest of this is.
So they were investigating a small room that someone had been apparently murdered in, and they were doing an investigation. And my significant other's character walked up to a desk that had been trapped. She triggered the trap, got shot in the stomach with a arrow bolt, and because they're level 1 characters, and the particular hit happened to be a critical, it didn't kill her outright, which was fine because I didn't want the character to just die right out there because this is game 2. That's kind of screwy. But I let her get shot anyway, and I rolled the dice to get the damage. She had 2 hit points left, and she's like, "Holy crap!" But then what happened that kind of irked me a little bit was that nobody else at the table, they kept investigating the room. They didn't save their party member that's bleeding to death on the floor. And,
really?
They didn't do anything.
Nobody rolled like a medicine check or used healing word or anything
else. No, nobody did anything else. It was like, wow, you guys are completely ignoring your party member bleeding to death on the floor. Okay.
Anyway, this is a psychotic party, dude. Like, what the fuck?
Well, after the game session, I was approached by one of the other players, and he looked kind of puzzled, and I was like, "What's up?" And he's like, "Dude, why did you hit Sasha so much damage?" And I'm like, "Because that's what the dice said." He's like, "Yeah, but she's your girlfriend, dude. Be nice to her." I'm like, "That's not how this works, man. You have to be unbiased because she's not her in the game. She's a character. And why the heck didn't you guys do that?" But that's a whole other ball of wax. But I go out of my way to make sure that favoritism doesn't crop up from me as a game master, because I've fallen into that trap before, and it's really, really hard to get out of. It can completely destroy a game. It can actually make other friends of yours be like, "We're not going to play with Xander because his girlfriend's going to get all the cool stuff, and we're just going to be, following her coattails, and I don't want to deal with that." So it's a really, really bad situation once you fall yourself into it.
That is the perfect example of like this whole episode, actually. I actually wish you would have told me this beforehand, but I stopped you. It's my fault. But that leads perfectly into, like, how do we even judge what is favoritism and what's just a fudged roll? So, first of all, I like that you did just take the critical hit and say, yeah, you get hit with a critical. I have a feeling that your players might have thought that when she was down and bleeding out, you were probably going to hand wave that in some way, is my guess, based on the end of the story.
Yeah.
They should have done something.
They were all new players. They played a couple of other smaller campaigns, and it was the classic meat grinders that they did. So
okay, so they're like, oh, PC died, that's usual. Okay, let's move on.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes
so
that makes
I didn't really
sense.
it just irked me a little bit, and I'm like, you want me to be favoritist at the table? That doesn't make any sense.
Dude, that baffles me. Like that's like a whole. It has to be a whole episode just dissecting that story. We can't stay on that for this long. But all right, but that is still a good example. So what you had the option to do, you actually had 2 options during that. You had the chance of favoritism, and you also had just a chance of a fudged roll. Now, the difference between the two, and this is very important to determine, because even in the same situation, it could be different depending on what you choose to do. If it's only favoritism, if you would not afford that same roll or that same fudged roll to anyone else at the table. I don't care if it's your least favorite player sitting on the corner who barely talks, or your best friend since childhood. Like, if you treat them both equally, that's just a fudged roll, and there's a whole debate on that, but that's fine. I'm in favor of some fudged rolls to some extent.
Yeah,
if you listen to the other podcast.
Yeah, there's a time and place for GM metagaming specifically. There's some good things about it, some really bad things about it, but check out our other podcast.
But let's talk about why it is a better story, just to it, like how not showing favoritism also gives you a better story. Because if you do show favoritism, it might be a great story for you and that one person that it's not going to be a great story for everyone. But
Everybody. That's the thing.
if you bite the bullet, you roll the dice, and you say you take 80 whatever damage, and you instantly die. Yeah, it's going to feel terrible right then, but
Yeah.
at the end of the game, like maybe your SO rolls up another character that they like more than they did before.
Yeah.
Maybe this critical like death inspires the party to take on the main villain.
Hmm.
There's all sorts of possibilities with just making the hard choice and doing the thing that might not be immediately fun in the moment, but leads to a much better story. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's basically just show the same courtesy to anyone at the table, whether
Exactly.
random player that you pulled from the street, like got that guy who was thrown up on the side. It turns out he plays D&D. Like he's at
Yeah.
the
Hey,
table
there you
now.
go. Come on, man. Come play with us. You know what? You
Like
want some soda? It looks like you haven't drank anything in like 6 months. Yeah. When I sit down and I plan a campaign, and one of the things that I go through is um, specifically when dealing with characters' backstories. That's another thing where you can unintentionally show favoritism, is dealing with a character who is important to you. Now, you might not be favoritist to this particular person as the player, but you might show favoritism to a specific character. That's also a trap that you can
that's a
fall
good
into.
distinction.
Hmm. So when you're going through like the creation of how to inject their backstories into, your game, you have to be willing and able to either see everybody at the table get the same amount of backstory information and they get to interact with it. Now, it might not be immediate, and we've covered this before, but if you can't do it and you don't think you can realistically hold that, just don't do it at all, because you are unintentionally showing one particular character's depth of story, and another character is just left on the sideline and they have to develop everything in play without that help from the GM. So being able to identify where you are making these mistakes, if you are, because you might not even realize that you're being favoritist until either another player brings it up, or I actually have had a moment or two where the player that I was being favoritist to kind of came up and said, "Hey, um, something about this doesn't feel right. I'm not quite sure what it is, but why would you give me this thing? And it doesn't make any sense." And then I had to kind of, back up and reanalyze and look at it. It was like, yeah, I kind of was being favoritist. So I put a hard rule on myself to kind of combat that, because if I don't, I know I will fall into that trap. And you have to be hard on yourself as a GM. You have to tell a good story. There's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of, work that you put into all of your campaigns,
Let's go into that
and
pressure
you
real
have to be
quick,
really hard.
because something that I want to also bring up is favoritism doesn't just apply to the people that you like the most, like your significant other, best friend,
Oh,
etc.
absolutely not.
Favoritism could also result as a preventative measure to avoid pain because you fear something from a player, such as the overly charismatic person who's sitting at your table who you've seen them get upset before when things don't go their way, and maybe
Oh,
you
yeah.
don't want to have that result happen. So maybe you don't hit them with the killing blow. Maybe you give them an item that they were looking for at some point, just to avoid the possible
Confrontation.
the confrontation, the negative
Yeah.
consequences. And that's
Um,
just as much favoritism as like being in love with somebody, because
yeah.
you're still only directing that at one person. You're not giving everybody else the same courtesy, and
Yeah.
you are it's effectively cheating at that point. uh
Effectively.
yeah.
Yeah. The short answer to that, which is a really really hard line to draw, would be just don't have players that react like that in your campaigns.
Yeah,
But
but
if you
that's
don't have a lot of
impossible, dude.
choice,
Also, you can't
it's
predict
really impossible.
everybody's reaction. Like maybe the person who's normally really timid, you kill their character, and then all of a sudden they go batshit. Like that's never something you would have expected. And I mean,
No,
an
no, it's not.
emotional reaction isn't like bad. Like people are going to get
No.
upset about things. It's just
Oh,
when it's when
absolutely.
you're worried. It's when you're worried about the stuff that might happen and focus on the might instead of the what is going on right now.
Yeah. And that actually draws through to the fact that favoritism can be at your table that has nothing to do with you as a GM. There have been games that both Nick and I have played in or DM'd for where one particular player shows favoritist ideas to another player, and their characters kind of meld like that, and they don't show that same kind of thing back and forth. Now, that's not to say that one character cannot have a super close relationship with another character,
Absolutely not.
because that happened with me and Jesse, because my character Slick and his character Doublejack were like super dude bros, and they're like best friends, and they had been for years upon years upon years. And when he died, it was really hard on DJ. And my next character was not besties with the dude. He kind of ignored him half the way.
It was very
And
standoffish. You were
very
distrustful of a lot
standoffish.
of the players.
Yeah.
And that's actually a good example for like how to identify if a player is showing favoritism to another player. If you
Yeah.
want to look out for this, if you have a campaign that has like any kind of misdirection or subterfuge in it, such as in this example Shadowrun, when
Yeah.
because you meet a team you've never seen before, you don't know their reputation, you don't know if you could trust them, you don't know if they're going to backstab you or rat you out to the corporations or what. So your character is like naturally like not gonna give out as much information or be as
Yeah.
forthcoming with things. But if you see another player who is interacting with this character and those characters aren't related, but for some reason these characters mesh well really easily, that's a big flag for notifying favoritism.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you're sitting down at the table, you can tell this as you can see when another player is having preferential treatment to another player. Now, this is a really hard thing to kind of combat, because you can't be you can walk up to the players and say, hey, look, I noticed that you're really showing a lot of you know interest in the other character, and I think that's because the player is so close to you. Do you want to sit down and analyze this? Do you want to work on how to work this out? Because when you have two players that are basically off in the corner doing their own thing, they'll share information back and forth, they'll share monetary wealth back and forth, but everybody else, screw them. This is a cooperative story game.
Yeah, if they're
You are all
sharing
working
stuff that they
together.
wouldn't be sharing normally, like credits or like I don't know, some magic item that one character really wanted to have and like is like clutching it like the one ring and refuses to give it up, but then suddenly they give it up to another player. Like that could be
Yeah.
favoritism, but you also have to keep an eye out for like there might be in play reasons for that, such as let's use the Lord of the Rings example. When Frodo has to give the ring over to Samwise, like initially he's corrupted by the ring and doesn't want to do it, but like because of in-play reasons, like he would eventually hand it over. Now, if these are two new
Yeah.
characters that have never met each other before, and he's just like, "Ah, Sam, take the ring," then it's like, "Motherfucker, what?"
Yeah, like you've got to be able to identify, and it's pretty easy to see that kind of thing. Now, there's a caveat to that. It is possible for in play for characters to build and grow relationships that are independent of the really good role players and people that have been role playing together for a long time sometimes end up doing this. It might seem like on the surface like that could be a problem, but you will be able to tell whether or not the players themselves interact independently of that, and you'll be able to tell whether or not the players are showing favoritist movements back and forth. A really good example of this is me and my character Kenton and another player's character Mara are in a relationship in this game. Now, the players, me and the Mara's play, we get along fairly fine. We're decently good friends. We've been playing together for a few years, but we're not attached to each other in any way. We play this game together. Would Kenton do something for Mara that he might not do for somebody else? Well, absolutely. The characters are in a
I would expect you
relationship that
to,
he
in fact.
feels it's expected. Would Xander do something for Mara's player that he wouldn't do for anybody else? I mean, actually, that's a really bad analogy.
Dude, you
I think
just
of a
drew
backward
yourself into a fucking corner. All
I
right.
drew myself into a corner.
Well,
Uh,
I get your example, but
yeah.
let's talk about some specific things that we can see happening that might indicate favoritism. Now, none of these are going to be a guaranteed thing, and we're going to break it down by like when you're sitting at the GM spot, when you're not, and one other like when you're a player and you're seeing a GM do it, or you're like a player and seeing the players do it, or something like that. But
Yeah,
we'll
yeah,
we'll go with the simplest one since this is playing God. Then let's talk with you being the GM. So, to identify something like this in yourself, one of the first things you got to look for is at any point, do you feel like you need to fudge a roll for somebody that you wouldn't want to do for somebody else given the same situation? Uh, these fudge rolls can be anything from like you don't add up the damage the right way. Maybe you drop one of the dice when you're supposed to roll damage, or maybe you roll the d20 to hit and it comes out as a natural 20. Maybe you nudge that a little bit over to the 19 to make sure that whoever you're targeting doesn't blow up. Uh,
yeah.
if you feel like you have to do that at any point, then that's probably a good sign that you are showing some form of favoritism, or at least you've gotten to the point where the choice is presented before you, and you can either go with your instinct, which would probably be favoritism, or you could go with you could think it through and see what the best solution is. Because
Hmm.
much like the rest of this episode, that could be something that you decide to do with anyone anyway. So if you're sitting there and you're thinking, I would do this for another player, and I think this is the best choice, then do it. Uh,
Yeah, absolutely.
every table's different. Maybe your table doesn't want any kind of fudge rolls, and they just wouldn't like it in general. In which case, that's a real easy way to determine like uh, you don't have to do it. You could just be like, there. I know some GMs who just roll right in front of everyone, like
Yep.
no screen, no nothing. Like they even to the point where they will tell you what the bonus is, where it's like
Yep.
roll 5d6 plus 8 damage or something like that, and they'll
And
let
they'll
you
roll it
know.
right in front of you.
And then they roll
And
all sixes, and you're like, fuck.
yep. Well, sorry about your luck there, buddy. The dice say what they say, and that's a good way to go about it. However, um,
I don't
when
personally
you're
do that.
I don't personally do that either. I've done that for some games because that's what the players really wanted to deal to how to deal with that, and I usually do that for new players so that they aren't getting any mixed signals or mixed messages from me. I'm usually a little bit more harsh on that where I'm concerned with new players because they're being introduced into this game. They need to know that the dice do mean something, and that I'm not going to go back on something just because I bleh. But there's metagame times to metagame and times not. Another way to identify when you're being favoritist is if you have 4 players and there are 4 monsters and the monsters rush and they're going into attack, logic would denote that one monster per one person. Now, if you have a barbarian, that's obviously a threat. Take him down first, kind of deal. But
Yeah, we don't need to
if
get in the
one
whole
of
tactics
these,
of that because maybe these monsters would gang up on one person as a
yeah,
part of a tactic thing. But yeah, keep
yeah.
going.
But when you're looking at it, if you are intentionally not having your NPCs monsters attack, or you're intentionally bringing a specific NPC who is going to give information to the same player character over and over, you're probably showing some favoritism. The point of this game is to tell, we keep coming back to this, is to tell a cooperative story. If one person is getting all of the information, or if one person is never getting attacked, that's an easy indicator right there that you're probably showing that particular player preferential treatment. Um, Now, when tactics are involved, and if it's the
That's why
face,
I mean we've
that makes
established
sense.
all this stuff is kind of up in the air a lot of the times.
Yeah.
But let's say whether you are the GM or not, something that you could also kind of pick out is if there is a disproportionate distribution towards like 1 or 2 players in terms of like magic items. Like maybe you go through this an epic encounter to find this item that one player really wants, but the DM also won't make another similarly epic encounter for a cool item that's important to the story that another player wants. Maybe they just get handed that, or maybe it doesn't show up at all, and
Yeah,
that's kind of a red flag. This
yes,
also
it is.
occurs when if you're distributing a bunch of gold and somebody other than the rogue tries to take more than their fair share, then
Because the rogue does.
'cause
Let's just
I make it a
make it.
point when I play a rogue to not do that, just out of
Yeah,
stereotype spite. But I
yeah,
mean, it's probably going to happen. There's in play reasons for stealing
probably.
from other players. I don't do it.
Oh yeah.
That's one of my intentional metagame things that I do because I think it's more fun to not do that. But there are times when that's totally applicable. But
Yeah.
if one player goes off on their own, because I'm all about splitting that party. But if one
Oh
person
yeah.
goes off on their own and they find a room that's filled with treasure and gold and all this, and there's like a bag of holding they could shove all that into, and then they get to fold that bag of holding up and tuck it away, so that's all their personal wealth. That while everybody else is fighting a Baylor like 2 rooms over, then that's a
No,
very
that's
clear
bad.
example of bad.
That's very clearly bad. Either your player is doing some real shady shit that they shouldn't be doing, or you're probably being a little bit favoritist.
But that's why we
Um,
keep everything up in the air because there might be
yeah,
like a possibility where it's like you're distracting the Baylor and this player actually did go over there to go loot all this shit and shove it in, like steal all the Baylor's treasure and then book it because you guys are only level 10 and you can't actually win this fight. Um, like there are reasons for it, but
oh yeah.
we're looking through this through the lens of we're assuming favoritism from this point on. So, what Xander? What might be some other ways that you can kind of identify this from either another GM or a player or even yourself?
Well, we've talked a lot about how a GM can kind of notice it in themselves, but not everybody listening to this is a GM.
True.
So, as a player, you can pick up on this. Now, sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes it's really subtle. And
Usually it
there's
is.
usually it is.
Let's not mince
Otherwise,
words. It's usually subtle.
it's usually subtle.
It's
Uh,
very doubtful that the GM is going to be like, "Yes, you. I like you the most. Thereby, you may have this +5 Holy Avenger. Everyone else, you get 1 torch."
I that sounds like it would actually be really funny to do,
If
but that
everybody at the see, if everybody at the table is cool with that, then that sounds like it's a fun game. But everybody at the table probably isn't cool with that.
yeah. Um, a good way to notice when favoritism is occurring at your gaming table and you're just one of the players um, is pay attention to who the NPCs are talking to. If the
Oh, that is a
GM
good
is
one.
constantly looking to his or her left at someone who is very important to him or her, just kind of always turning, what do you guys do? They are subconsciously asking this person what their character wants to
Yeah,
do.
what does your character do? Not everybody at the table.
Exactly.
You with the
And
+5
it's
Holy
completely
Avenger.
yeah, it could be completely subconscious. The GM might not even notice it's happening. Another way to see it is there a player in the corner that's just kind of sitting there watching? They're not on their phone. They're not doing anything disrespectful, but they're just watching. They're watching. They're watching. They barely get any gold when gold is distributed. They never get to go on any cool quests. There's no side missions that involve them. They don't really get to talk about the things that they've done. They don't talk about their backstory, and the GM never asks them. That is also favoritism because they're showing favoritism to the other players and excluding one.
Yes, it is
That
possible to
person,
have everybody showing favoritism except one or two
except for one
people.
person. Yeah. So if somebody's not being engaged by the GM, and as a GM, I know it's hard.
Okay, look,
Believe me.
a lot of responsibility does fall on the player to actually engage
Yeah.
themselves in the story, but not
Yeah.
everybody is ready to just jump on in. So it is the
Yeah.
GM's responsibility to be able to grab the spotlight and manually point it in their direction. And
Exactly.
if you do that and they still don't really want to like continue participating, that's okay. That's on them at that point. And you
Yeah.
could just be like, okay, if you don't really want to be like integral to the scene, we're going to scooch this spotlight right back over to the people who are clamoring for it.
Yeah. And uh, I've actually come in contact with players that they don't really want it, but when you give it to them, they're like, "Oh, okay. Well, I'll take this." And there was actually a moment in time where I had a player who was the off in the corner one, and every single time I tried to shine the spotlight at her, she really didn't want it, and so I did something that I don't usually, uh, condone a GM to do, but I sort of forced her hand. In
How
doing
so?
this, well, I brought a character from her backstory that completely ignored everybody else because it was her sister, so to
Mhm.
speak, and would only talk to this one person because that's her sister.
Yeah.
And by the end of the campaign, this barbarian, she was a barbarian. She would scream at the top of her lungs, scare my neighbors half to fucking death. Murder the interlopers! And she got into it and she got moving forward. And this particular player, who was only at the table because she really enjoyed stories and she really liked, engaging in them just a little bit though, became one of the greatest players that I've ever had the pleasure of playing with. And she still plays D&D to this day. I think she GMs a couple of different games, and sometimes you'll find yourself in that particular place, but most of the time that's not going to happen.
Ah, but Xander, that isn't favoritism because were it to be anyone else at the table who did that, I know you would have also extended that same backstory spotlight deal to whoever that other person was.
Well, yeah, but
See, that's the
painting
thing.
myself into a corner
Stop painting
again.
yourself into the corner. That's why we have an entire episode discussing this because there is a lot of nuance to this, and there
There
is a
is.
lot of I don't actually know if this is favoritism or not, and that's why
Hmm.
you just got to be able to see it from different perspectives, like roll perception and like whatever you get, it doesn't matter. Why did you roll a die for your own perception? Then
Isn't it a DC 10? I think we already covered this.
that's a DC 10 insight check to look into yourself or others at the table and find out if they're doing
Yeah.
favoritism stuff.
So, but you can tell if you pay attention both as a player and as a GM whether or not favoritism is occurring.
We're kind of
Players
breaking
might
this
not.
down a lot, but a, a lot of this is very instinctual just from human social
Yeah,
interaction. Like you're going to be sitting there and it's going to feel like favoritism. And I can't really describe that beyond like the examples we already did, but when it's there, you're going to notice it. Like the player that came up to Xander after the game who was like, "Hey, this just feels weird." Like
yeah,
sometimes that's all you get. And if that's what your gut's telling you, don't like blurt it out at right there at the center, like middle of the table, like in the middle of this game. Like
yeah.
maybe that is a good reason to just be like, hey, what's going on, guys? Like
Yep.
after the fact.
So when you find that you have or you are observing favoritist kind of uh, issues regarding your table, it might be really subtle. The people might not really know about it, but what are some of the things that we can do about it as a
Okay,
community?
right. So this is what it all comes down to, isn't it? Because we can
Yeah,
identify favoritism all day, but what can you do about it? Now,
yeah,
let's go ahead and take care of the two really obvious solutions that are kind of like one of them is overkill and one of them is expected. The first that is expected is talk to the goddamn GM in your table. Yeah,
oh yeah,
it's real obvious advice, and that's why we're not sticking very long with this. The other one that's complete overkill is consider walking away from the table and
hmm
not playing anymore. If it's that bad and you're not having that, that little fun, then it's just a better use of your time to leave.
yep. I know that I've been in the position, oddly enough, where I was in a specific game and my character, for reasons I still can't understand, was being shown favoritist kind of things, and it felt really uncomfortable for me. There was really nothing that I could do about it. I talked to the GM, I talked to the other players. I tried my best to kind of scooch things along at the players because my character was kind of pseudo given the spotlight and the leadership role and all of the everything without any real recognition as to why beyond it made sense that this person is the thing.
Mm.
So I actually me and one of the other players actually stepped away from that game and said, you know what, we can't do this. The story is it's fun, but you have to be able to know when your limit is, and don't sit down at a table and stay there because you feel like somebody's going to be mad at you,
Yeah, you
or
draw your
because you
own
feel
line. Don't let other people cross it.
exactly. Don't let that happen to you. There is no one that can stop it except for you and the people around the table. And if no one else at the table wants to admit it, you might have to walk away from it. It sucks. It hurts.
Yeah,
You
and
end
that's
up
why it's the
losing the
overkill
story.
option. So
But
not
that
and
happens.
obviously not everything's gonna be like as easy to decide or as black and white as we're making it out to be. So let's go
Oh
into
no.
stuff that where you could take steps to resolve it, even if it's not an easy resolve. So let's go back to an example we had earlier where you have a player and her significant other sitting at your table while you are the GM and they are showing each other favoritism. One thing you could do as a GM is to physically separate them from where they are sitting. So if they
Yep.
come into your table, they don't get to sit next to each other. Sorry, it's
Yep.
assigned seating now. And
Yep.
like that, since that physically puts them in different locations. If they want to talk to each other, they have to talk across the table, which means they're getting the table involved. If they're
Yep.
not next to each other, that's much less incentive for them to like lean over and ask like certain questions or do like that really small role play thing that we've all seen people do, where
Yeah.
normally is not a bad thing because you want your characters to role play, but when it becomes favoritism, that's when it's the problem. So
Yeah.
by physically separating them, that that actually usually resolves the issue right away for player
Mhm.
on player favoritism.
Yeah, usually. Also, if your players that are that are having this issue feel upset about that, then talk to them about it, obviously, but you might have to consider expelling them from your game, because if they're getting upset that they don't get to sit next to one another and do their little thing in the corner, then maybe they should just go home and do that little thing by themselves and
I've
not
seen, I've
because
actually seen people do this. Like, I've seen a couple who just plays, well, not just plays, but they have like a game where it's just them. It's just them role
yeah,
playing, and that's fine. It's only two of them. It's fine. Like,
it's
you can
fine.
favoritism all you want. Like, it doesn't matter
Yeah.
anymore.
There's one other player and one GM, or you guys might swap GM. I've done that before. One-on-one stuff is perfectly fine, but if your players can't really get around to that, you don't want them at your table because that's taking away from the other people at the table who just want to enjoy the story.
It's also
I
taking away from you.
Oh yeah, as GM, it's sucking your life force out
I don't know, I
like a
wouldn't go
life
that far,
sucker.
but it definitely puts an extra strain that doesn't need to be there in an already fairly complicated thing that you have to set up to start with.
Oh, even easy systems are not easy to GM, and if you're adding, micro nuances and socialization into it to the point where it's so taxing on you, then adjust fire
This is a hobby,
for your own sake. This
so
is a hobby. You're
you
doing it for fun. Don't kill yourself for
unless
it.
unless for some reason these players are specifically handing you cash to run a game for them and do all the favoritism stuff. I don't know why anybody would do that, but that's like the only example I could think of where that would, I guess, be okay, because you
Actually,
are
did you know that
accepting money.
you can be a GM for hire? Did you know that?
You can what?
Yes, you can go
How?
on. You can go online, and there are places where, if you're a decent GM, you can show some credentials and some papers from other players that you've played with in the past, and they will pay you to be their GM because there's a lot of players and not a lot of good GMs out there. You can actually do that.
Well, I got some fucking credentials for you. Okay, well that's really good to know, and I'm going to talk to you about that more after this episode. So what else can we do? Let's say that now we're not the GM and we don't have total control over the table. It's not at our house. It's whatever the worst possible scenario is that you could think of to
Oh man.
that doesn't go like completely off the rails. Like let's say you hitch a ride with the GM's significant other in their car, drive to the GM's house, which is I don't know, like the next city over. It's like a 15-minute drive. Something that's kind of significant. And you're
Oh
sitting
god.
there halfway through the game. and you just can't handle this anymore. You can't really walk away, can you? Because
No, you can't. You're
unless you
kind
want
of
to pay a
stuck.
bunch of money for an Uber.
Dude, I've been in that situation. That sucks. Let me
That's
tell
why I
you.
brought it up, because that's a very awkward position to be in,
It is
and
a really awkward
we want a
position.
real example that we kind of sink our teeth into. What so Zam? Do you have any initial ideas of what you could do as this player? You've been in this
Well,
situation before. How'd you handle it?
I've been in this situation before. The obvious is after the game. Wait till after the game. Don't screeching halt it in the middle of the table and point these things out, because that will ruin the game completely. It's gone forever. The ability to pick it back up after that is going to be severely uh uh
It's not
it's
happening at
probably not
that
going to
point.
happen.
It's going to be way
It's
too
done.
awkward, and people are going to be really bad moods. So yeah, just
Yeah.
that's not really an option.
After the game, talk to the GM, or talk to the player, because the player might not also realize it, and neither might the GM.
That's true.
First thing, talk to your GM. Say, hey, did you notice that you were doing this, this, and this? I don't want to, make it seem like you're doing that, but maybe you weren't aware of
Or you
it.
could
I
also
thought I would
ask,
bring it to
like,
your attention.
why wasn't I or this other player who isn't related to the problem, why weren't we able to interact the same way with X, whatever X happens
Yeah,
to be?
yeah. And if you have a good GM, they'll be like, hmm, I don't know, but I'll get back to you on that. Let me think about it. And that's going to be the answer that you're probably going to get is, I didn't notice that. Let me think
Yeah, I
about that.
mean, you let people
And that's
think.
acceptable.
Like there's gotta be some time for some self-reflection, especially if
Mm-hmm.
everybody's still coming down from like the high of playing the game. Maybe
Oh,
you're not because you didn't really enjoy it, but
yeah.
like you gotta ease into it. Don't just be like, "Hey, why were you showing favoritism?"
Yeah. Another way to handle it, this is significantly more covert, um, but might single you out to be the person that gets messed with more often. Please recognize that that is a possibility. So do
Well,
this
yeah,
one
but
with
like
care,
after this initial example, and if nothing gets resolved, then you don't go back to the game once you're out of
and
the
then don't
awkward
go back to the game.
situation. We're assuming you're
Another
still
thing,
there.
yeah. Another thing is, if you don't want to talk to the GM directly, which you should, but if you don't want to, you think it, well, maybe it's just not a big deal. Um, as a character, take as a player, take your character and do your best to forcibly assert your character into the situation between the GM and that individual that is being favored. It's like draw that player's attention and draw it away from that particular scenario. And that awkward feeling that the GM and that person might get will be enough of a clue.
That is a way
It's
to
kind
do
of
it.
covert.
I
It's
tend to
kind of
stay
covert, but it
away
could get
from trying
shocking.
to solve out of play problems in play.
Yeah,
I've tried it enough times that I found it just doesn't work.
yeah,
What you can do, however, something that might be a little easier if you're really nervous about trying to bring this up to your GM, is another player at the table probably noticed this too. So
yeah,
talk to the other like regular players first, not the people who are causing the problem, but like the random guy from the street who showed up. Like maybe pull him aside after the game and be like, "Man, that was really fun. I really liked this, this, and this. But did you notice this?" And then
hmm
it's likely the player will just say, "Oh yeah, I saw a little bit of that. What was up with that?" And then then it's not like you are singling
You,
yourself out like you're a buzzkill. Instead, it's just like, yeah, you just go to them one by one and be like, "Oh yeah, I guess we did see this," and then you could address it as friends and just be
yeah.
like, "Hey, this is happening. Can we just like not do this as much anymore or something?" Because people
I think
aren't
that's
really going to
actually
be
the
bitter and butthurt about like favoritism if it happens one time, and it's just like, "Oh
yeah, no,
shit, oh I didn't mean to do that," and then you just drop it and
yeah.
everybody's good.
Especially if they're not aware of it. Like I've been in the position where I was completely unaware that I was showing favoritist tendencies, and I've had multiple players and sometimes just one be like, "Hey, dude, did you notice this?" Oh, no, I did not. But thank you for bringing that up. I will do my best to not let that happen again. And that's the way your GM should handle it. If they don't handle it that way, you might not want them to be your GM anymore.
Mm-hmm. Those are some pretty concrete examples, I think. Obviously, a lot of this is going to come down to a case by case basis, like what your situation is, how comfortable you are with talking to people, how
Hmm.
how amiable the players and GMs in question are to change. Not everybody
Yeah,
will be. Most people will. Most people will be fine with that, and a lot of times it would just generally make for a better game anyway. It's not like this
yeah,
is some giant conflict that you need to resolve. It's really just a minor thing. And if it turns into a giant conflict, that's a really good indicator that you should just leave. But
yeah,
until that point, just take it slow. Just don't be aggressive about it,
yeah.
and pretty much everyone will listen. You might not get immediate change. It might be a little slow because especially if it's like I don't know, maybe like a newlywed couple who are like still really infatuated with each other, and you kind of see it diminish over the next few games, but it doesn't like go away immediately. Well, if you're feeling like it's getting better, then just give it time and just like
Definitely give
stay
it
back a
time.
little bit. But if it's not changing, then you
Or
don't.
getting worse.
Yeah, or getting worse, then I don't just like get up from the table and walk out the front door, but like come to the GM after the game and say, "Hey, I know you want to play the game this way. I find this to be very uncomfortable when I'm playing this game. So
Hmm.
if we can't change this, then I am probably going to find another game table."
Yeah.
It's not like attacking them directly where you're like, you, I don't like you and the way you're running the game and all this favoritism that you're showing.
Mer, mer,
You need to
mer.
stop. But instead, it's
Rah.
like you're coming to them just like you would any of your friends, or like
Yeah,
maybe even coworkers if you're more buddies with them. But
yeah.
that's pretty much all you have to
Um,
do.
the last scenario that and how to deal with where if you're at a table and you're the newbie and you're getting, or maybe you're not a newbie but you're not getting any of the story, any of the spotlight, and you might be a little timid in asking for it, because when you're sitting at a game table, especially when you don't have the powerful personality that some of the players have. I know I have a rather powerful personality as a gamer. um, that might drown you down. And if you don't feel comfortable asserting yourself, instead of talking to the GM, talk to one of the other players, because you might not be getting the spotlight and you might be getting effectively ignored off in the corner. The GM might not have the tools. If they listen to our podcast, they might, but they might not have the tools to really deal with that. They might be a fairly new GM. It takes a long time to do this well, and it takes an even longer time to perfect it. I am certainly not a perfect
I
GM.
mean,
I know
still,
Nick's
there's
not.
still improvement. There's no real thing as perfection,
Yeah,
especially when it comes to
yeah.
storytelling.
But you can always do stuff to improve yourself as a GM, and you can always do stuff to improve yourself as a player. If you find yourself in that position, talk to one of the other players. Like, hey, I'm not really getting any meat of the story, and I really don't want to talk to the GM about it because he's got a plan and he's doing his own thing to kind of give us the story. So I don't really want to shake the boat, but maybe we as players might you know involve our characters in something, and slowly gather yourself to kind of add yourself into the group, because once you endear yourself effectively as a character to one of the other characters, it's a chain reaction that happens at that point. I've watched it happen dozens and dozens of times over game tables where a player is kind of meek, kind of mild, don't really want to get into anything, and then suddenly, for no reason that's explicable by me, beyond the fact that I think I just explained it, they two characters start getting along really, really well, and then they start, doing stuff together. They watch each other's back in combat, and then the other players will notice that and be like, "Hey, she's coming around. That's cool," or "He's coming about. That's awesome." And they'll slowly get, side scenes, and that will naturally draw that player, if you're that player, into the spotlight. It will bring you to the GM's attention subconsciously, and that's a good way to go about it if you don't want to do anything directly. I know Nick is a proponent of doing handling out of game things out of game, and in-game things.
I like
And
doing things
there's a
directly because
possibility.
you either resolve the issue, take steps towards resolving the issue, or you don't resolve it and you know what's going to happen next. And
Yeah.
I think that's just easier to comprehend from purely an out of game perspective. The reason why I don't like doing that kind of stuff in play is because that might be misconstrued as the character or like something in play that's going on that you're trying to change, and then nobody
Maybe.
because at a certain point that somebody's subconscious or like however you can identify like the micro movements of facial expressions and all that, then that might just get completely lost. They might be thinking, oh yeah, yeah, well, I'm doing a great job. Their character's just really complaining about this one thing. Wonder why they're doing that. And then instead of thinking it might be an out of play problem, they might be trying to also resolve the perceived in play problem with an in play solution, which gives you no actual solution and nothing actually changes. You just did a lot of work as a GM for something that should have been discussed out of play.
Yeah. There are the possibility to handle a lot of things out of play. My suggestion is if you have the capacity to, some people just don't, and that's okay. Then handle it out of play. If you can't, then try to work your way in, or maybe this might not be the table for you. But all in all, there will always be some kind of issue around the table, be it favoritism, be it any dozens of things, because we're all humans. We are naturally natural to err. So we're going to make mistakes as GMs. We're going to make mistakes as players. Um,
Oh, air as in
recognize
ERR. I thought you said air as in AIR. I was like, what the fuck? Like, yeah,
no,
we
no,
breathe air, but like, huh?
no, we're naturally gonna fuck shit up. That's what we do as humans. So one of the things that just you try to pull into yourself is be capable of willing to confront the situation head on out of game. Don't be aggressive with it, but just try to take it as respectfully as you can. But a lot of the time you can handle it easier than you thought you could, and it could be an issue that might just completely evaporate because you said, hey, I didn't really want to bring this up to you, man, but I noticed this, and that's really uncomfortable for me. Is there any way we can work this out, do something about it? And the GM might look at you and be like, you know what, I didn't notice that. Don't worry about it. I got you back. And then the next game, it's gone.
Mm-hmm.
It's usually that simple.
That's really
If you
why I
don't,
like the direct approach because you
yeah.
you either just solve the problem before it really becomes a problem, or you know your answer already.
hmm It's like I've been in situations 9 times out of 10. That's what will happen. It'll just it will become easier to just deal with it. So try to do it out of game. If you can't, then well, subterfuge that shit if you got to.
But thank you all for listening. We wanted to bring up this topic in particular because it's a prevalent problem that I haven't really heard anybody talk about seriously, so I wanted to do it. I've experienced this in thankfully few games in my gaming career, but when I have, it has been very frustrating. We hope to have helped you if you're dealing with this sort of situation, and we want to hear back from you if you have a way to deal with favoritism or just want to share your own stories. So head on down there to the comments section and tell us all about it. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on any Starblade's content, and we'll see you next time on Playing God.
Later, man.